Elias Thorne stands in the dusty heat of Henderson's mercantile, the sheer size of him seeming to shrink the already cluttered space. Shelves groan under the weight of tin goods, bolts of fabric, and sacks of flour. The air thick with the competing smells of coffee beans, leather, and cheap soap. Outside, the sun beats down on the single dusty street of Prairie Ridge, bleaching the life from everything it touches. Elias needs a cook. Desperately. His last one, a grizzled old prospector who'd claimed culinary skills after his gold claim ran dry, had nearly poisoned the entire ranch crew with a concoction he called possum stew, but which tasted suspiciously of skunk. The man had fled in the night, taking a side of bacon and Elias's least favorite skillet with him. Now, his four hands are surviving on a diet of hardtack and Elias's own burnt offerings, and their grumbling is starting to sound less like camaraderie and more like mutiny. The stagecoach, a dusty red harbinger of news and new faces, rattles to a stop outside, its arrival the day's main event. Henderson, a man whose body was as soft as his gossip was sharp, peers over his spectacles through the front window. A lone figure disembarks. A woman. She stands uncertainly for a moment, clutching a small, worn carpet bag as if it's the only solid thing in the world. She's small, almost bird-like, and seems to be trying to fold in on herself to take up as little space as possible. She smooths her plain, travel-worn dress and makes her way toward the mercantile, her gaze fixed on the boardwalk beneath her feet. When the bell above the door jingles, she flinches. Henderson gives her a dismissive once-over, his eyes lingering on her cheap dress and the exhaustion etched on her young face. "Help you?" he asks, his tone suggesting he doubts it. I'm looking for work," she says, her voice barely a whisper. "Anything. Mending, cleaning, cooking." Henderson lets out a short, derisive huff. "Not much call for that. Folks round here handle their own. The saloon might need a new girl for washing glasses, but you don't look the type." He says it not as a compliment, but as another mark against her. Elias watches from the back of the store, where he'd been inspecting the quality of a new shipment of rope. He sees the way her shoulders slump at the storekeeper's words, the flicker of panic in her eyes before she quashes it. He sees the raw desperation she's trying so hard to hide. She's running from something. It's as plain to him as the brand on his own cattle. He doesn't know what it is, and he doesn't rightly care. What he sees is a person at the end of their rope, and something in his own solitary soul resonates with that. He needs a cook. She needs a job. The math is simple. He takes a step forward, his boot heels loud on the worn floorboards. Both Henderson and the woman turn to look at him, their expressions mirroring each other in surprise. Elias's shadow falls over them both. "She can cook?" he asks, his voice a low rumble that seems to vibrate through the floor. Henderson sputters, caught off guard. "Well, she said so." "Thorne, you can't be serious." Elias ignores him, his gaze fixed on the woman. "I have a ranch. Need a cook for my hands. It's hard work. Pay is $10 a month, plus room and board. The roof doesn't leak and the food is plain but filling, long as you're the one cooking it." The woman's head snaps up, her eyes wide. She looks from Elias's towering, unreadable form to Henderson's sneering face and back again. Hope, fragile and tentative, flickers in her expression. "Ah, yes, I can cook. I can cook very well," she says, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. Henderson scoffs again. "Thorne, you don't know a thing about her. She could be a thief, or worse." Elias's gaze hardens as it settles on the storekeeper. It's a look that has stopped charging bulls and silenced insolent cowboys. Henderson's mouth snaps shut. Elias turns his attention back to the woman. He doesn't offer a smile or a comforting word. He just states a fact, a decision made and settled. And with his next words, his life and hers are irrevocably changed. "She'll work for me." They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. She tells him her name is Clara May. She says it so quietly on the wagon ride out of town that he almost misses it the sound swallowed by the creak of the wheels and the jingle of the harness. The silence between them was a living thing, vast and heavy as the prairie sky. Elias was not a man given to idle chatter, and Clara may seem to have a deep-seated fear of it. She sat ramrod straight on the buckboard seat, her hands clenched tightly around her worn bag, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon as if searching for a threat. Elias drove the team with an easy, practiced hand, his thoughts churning. He'd acted on an impulse, a gut feeling he couldn't explain. He'd seen the shadow in her eyes, a kind of hunted look he recognized not from people, but from a coyote caught in a trap, willing to chew its own leg off to get free. Henderson's casual cruelty had solidified the decision. Elias had a deep-seated loathing for men who used their small measure of power to kick those who were already down. Taking her on was as much an act of defiance against the town's petty judgments as it was a solution to his culinary problem. His ranch, the Bartee, was nestled in a wide basin, cupped by a ring of low, rugged hills that broke the monotony of the plains. It was a hard piece of land, wrested from the earth by his father and held onto by Elias through grit and sheer stubbornness. He'd inherited it along with a mountain of debt after a fever took both his parents within a week of each other a decade ago. At 20, he'd become a master of a struggling enterprise, his only companions the wind, the cattle, and a rotating cast of hired hands. The solitude had carved itself into his features, leaving him with a gravity that made him seem older than his 30 years. As they crested the last rise, the ranch came into view. A long, low-slung ranch house built of timber and sod, a sturdy barn, a web of corrals, and a bunkhouse for the men. It wasn't much, but it was his. Every splintered fence post, every shingle on the roof, was a testament to his labor. He saw Clara's eyes take it all in, her expression unreadable. To her, it might look like the edge of the world, a place of profound isolation. To Elias, it was the center of his universe. He pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the main house. "This is it," he said, the words feeling inadequate. He gestured toward the house. "Kitchen's through there. Your room is off the back of it. It's small, but it's private." She nodded, sliding carefully off the wagon seat before he could offer a hand. She moved with a quiet efficiency, as if trying to make herself as unobtrusive as possible. He led her inside. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace, flanked by a couple of worn leather chairs and a table piled with ledgers and maps. It was a man's space, smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and dust. The kitchen was a different world. It was large and functional, with a massive cast-iron stove, a long work table, and shelves filled with basic provisions. It was clean, but lacked a soul. It was a place where tasks were performed, not where life was lived. "The men eat at sunup, noon, and sundown," Elias explained, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "There's 4 of them, Jed, Billy, and the 2 brothers, Frank and Cole. They're good men, but they have appetites like wolves. Keep the coffee pot on. That's the main thing." Clara surveyed the space, her gaze lingering on the stove, the pantry. A flicker of something, perhaps relief, or maybe even purpose, crossed her face. "I'll need to see what supplies you have," she said, her voice still quiet but now laced with a new, professional tone. It was the first time she'd sounded sure of anything. "Take stock. Make a list. I'll be going back to town in a few days," he said. He pointed to a narrow door at the far end of the kitchen. "That's your room." He left her then, feeling a strange awkwardness. He'd bought and sold cattle, negotiated with bankers, and faced down storms. But dealing with this small, quiet woman in his own kitchen left him feeling clumsy and out of his depth. He went to the barn, the familiar smell of hay and horseflesh a comfort. Jed, his oldest hand, was mending a bridle. Jed was a man of 50, with a face like a dried apple and eyes that had seen everything twice. He didn't miss much. "New cook?" Jed asked without looking up from his work. "Name's Clara May," Elias confirmed. Jed grunted, testing a stitch with his thumb. "She looks like a strong wind would blow her clear to the next county." "She says she can cook," Elias said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Well, after Cletus's stew, anything's an improvement," Jed allowed. He finally looked up, his gaze shrewd. "Henderson's already flapping his gums, I wager. Town's probably got her tried and convicted of something by now." Elias's jaw tightened. "Let them talk." "Oh, they will," Jed said, a note of warning in his voice. "They'll talk. Just be ready for it, boss." The warning proved prescient. The next few days established a new rhythm on the bar T. Clara was a ghost in the house. She rose before the sun, and the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon was what woke the ranch hands now, not the clanging of a rusty triangle. Her meals were simple but delicious. Biscuits were light and fluffy, beans were savory, and the bread she baked was better than anything they could get in town. The men, initially wary of this silent, almost invisible woman, were quickly won over by their stomachs. Their grumbling ceased, replaced by appreciative murmurs and clean plates. Clara spoke little, answering direct questions with a quiet yes, sir, or no, sir to Elias, and a simple nod to the other men. She wore long-sleeved, high-necked dresses, even when the kitchen was sweltering from the heat of the stove. She moved with a perpetual caution, her eyes darting to the door whenever someone entered, a deep-seated tension in her posture that never fully eased. Elias found himself observing her in stolen moments. He'd see her kneading dough with a fierce concentration, her brow furrowed, or carefully measuring out spices, her movements precise and economical. The kitchen, under her care, was transformed. It smelled of baking bread and simmering stews. The surfaces gleamed. It was becoming the heart of the house, and she was its quiet, watchful keeper. He learned to read the small signs of her presence. A jar of wildflowers on the windowsill. The way the woodbox was always full before he thought to fill it. A plate with a slice of apple cake left on the main room table for him at night, long after everyone else was asleep. They were small, silent offerings, and he found himself looking forward to them. They were a language he understood better than words. But the world outside the ranch's bubble of quiet routine was not so peaceful. On his next trip to town for the supplies Clara had listed, the atmosphere was palpably different. When he walked into Henderson's mercantile, the low chatter of the two women at the counter stopped abruptly. They gave him sidelong glances before busying themselves with a bolt of calico. Henderson approached, a look of smug concern on his face. "Thorne," he began, "heard you took on that stray. Everything. Oh, right out of your place." "The cooking's improved," Elias said flatly, handing him the list. "That's all that matters." "Well, some are saying it's not proper," Henderson pressed on, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "A young woman like that, all alone out there with you and your men. Tongues are wagging." Elias's patience, a notoriously shallow well, began to run dry. "My men are fed, and she has a respectable job. Tell the tongues in this town to find something better to do than wag." His cold dismissal put an end to the conversation, but not to the whispers. As he loaded his wagon, he saw Sheriff Miller watching him from across the street, leaning against a post, arms crossed. The sheriff didn't wave or nod. He just watched, his expression a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Elias felt a familiar anger rise in him. The same anger he felt when bankers in faraway cities decided the fate of his land based on numbers in a ledger. It was the judgment of outsiders, of people who knew nothing of his life or his struggles, and it grated on his soul. He clicked the reins, urging the horses on, the dust of Prairie Ridge a bitter taste in his mouth. He was protecting a stranger, and in doing so, he had inadvertently drawn a target on them both. The quiet life he had so carefully constructed was beginning to feel fragile. Weeks turned into a month, and a fragile peace settled over the bar T. Clara's presence had become a quiet constant, as reliable as the sunrise. The ranch hands treated her with a gruff, almost paternal respect, born of full bellies and Elias's clear, unspoken directive. Billy, the youngest of the crew, had even taken to bringing her interesting rocks he found while out riding the fence lines, leaving them on the porch rail for her to find. She never acknowledged them directly, but Elias saw her once, turning a piece of white quartz over in her palm, a faint ghost of a smile on her lips. The transformation of his kitchen was complete. It was no longer just a functional space, but a warm, welcoming one. The long work table was scrubbed to a pale cream. The iron stove gleamed with polish, and a row of herbs grew in small tins on the windowsill. For Elias, who had lived for a decade in a house that was merely a shelter, it was a subtle but profound shift. The house was starting to feel like a home. His interactions with Clara remained brief and utilitarian, yet a delicate thread of awareness was being woven between them. He noticed the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating, the faint scent of cinnamon and flour that clung to her clothes, the weariness that settled deep in her eyes by the end of a long day. He found himself altering his own routines, making his trips to the kitchen for water late at night, after the hands were in the bunkhouse, hoping for one of those quiet moments where the house was still and it was just the two of them, separated by the lamplight and a chasm of unspoken history. The inciting incident, when it came, was as quiet and unexpected as Clara herself. It was a sweltering evening in late summer. A long day of branding had left every man exhausted and sore. Supper had been a subdued affair, the men too tired to do much more than eat. Elias had retreated to the main room to work on his ledgers. The numbers a familiar, frustrating puzzle. The ranch was barely breaking even, as always. A good cattle price in Dodge City could change everything, but that was months away. He rose, stretching the kinks from his massive frame, and walked toward the kitchen for a dipper of cool water from the bucket. The room was dim, lit by a single lantern on the work table where Clara was cleaning up. She was on her tiptoes, reaching up to place a heavy cast-iron pot on a high shelf. The movement was awkward, and as she strained, the long sleeve of her worn gray dress rode up her forearm, exposing the skin beneath. Elias stopped dead in the doorway. It wasn't just the pale, vulnerable skin of her arm. It was what was on it. A latticework of old scars, thin and white, crisscrossed her forearm like angry threads. They were old, faded, but unmistakable. And starkly different, near her wrist, was a newer mark, a deep, ugly bruise, mottled with shades of purple and yellow, in a shape that suggested the cruel arc of something heavy. The air in the kitchen went still and silent, save for the hum of crickets outside. Clara froze, her arm still outstretched. She must have felt his gaze on her, a physical weight. Her whole body went rigid. With a choked little gasp, she dropped the pot. It landed on the wooden floor with a deafening clang that echoed the sudden, violent hammering in her chest. Instantly, her other hand flew to her arm, yanking the sleeve down, hiding the evidence. But it was too late. He had seen. She wouldn't look at him. Her head was bowed, her shoulders hunched, as if anticipating a blow. He could see the tremor in her hands. The fear radiating from her was so potent it was almost a taste in the air, metallic and sharp. He knew what she was thinking. She was expecting him to be disgusted, to be angry, to question her, to accuse her, to cast her out. The world had clearly taught her to expect the worst from men, especially men who held power over her. Elias's own mind was a maelstrom. The sight of those marks had ignited a cold, hard fury deep in his gut. Those weren't the marks of an accident. They were the marks of deliberate, repeated cruelty. The faded lines told a story of long suffering. The fresh bruise spoke of a recent, brutal chapter. The hunted look he'd seen in her eyes that first day in town suddenly had a horrific context. Someone had done this to her. Someone had taken a cane or a strap or something worse to this small, quiet woman and left their signature on her skin. He wanted to demand a name. He wanted to ride out and find the man responsible and break him in two. The protective instinct that had been a low hum in the back of his mind for weeks roared to life, a savage, possessive thing. But he saw her terror, the way she was braced for an explosion, and he forced the rage down, banking it like a fire. Yelling, demanding, would only be another form of violence to her. It would only prove that he was just like whatever monster she had run from. He took a slow breath, forcing his hands to unclench at his sides. He didn't say a word about her arm. He didn't ask a single question. He simply walked past her, picked up the heavy pot from the floor, and placed it effortlessly on the high shelf she had been struggling to reach. His movement was calm and deliberate. He turned back, his face a granite mask that betrayed none of the fury raging within him. He looked at her bowed head for a long moment. "Leave the rest," he said, his voice a low, quiet rumble. "You've done enough for one day. Go get some rest." Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing alone in the flickering lamplight, his quiet, unexpected reaction a louder statement than any shout could ever have been. She didn't move for a long time, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading away, the heavy clang of the pot still echoing in the profound, terrifying silence. She had been discovered, but the explosion she had spent her life bracing for had not come. In its place was something she didn't understand at all. The night was endless for Clara. She lay in her small, dark room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling. The distant lowing of a cow, the soft nicker of a horse in the corral, the sigh of the wind across the roof. Every sound was magnified. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. She expected the door to be thrown open at any moment. She expected to be dragged out, accused, and sent away into the darkness she had just barely escaped. Mr. Thorne had seen. He knew she was damaged goods, marked and spoiled. He would not want her here now. Pity was one thing. The ugly reality of her past was another. But the door remained closed. The silence from a main house was absolute. She finally drifted into a shallow, nightmare-ridden sleep, only to wake with a start before the first hint of dawn, her heart pounding. Habit, ingrained by years of fear, drove her from the bed. She had to work, to make herself useful, to try and erase the stain of what he had seen. She entered the kitchen with a feeling of profound dread. But the room was empty, just as she had left it. The dishes she had abandoned were still on the drying rack. She took a shuddering breath and forced herself into the familiar rhythm of her morning chores. She built up the fire in the stove, her hands trembling so badly she could barely strike the match. She ground the coffee beans, the rasping sound grating on her raw nerves. She mixed the biscuit dough, her movements stiff and clumsy. The bunkhouse door slammed, and the sound of the men's boots on the hard-packed earth announced their approach. Clara braced herself. When they trooped in, they were boisterous as always, smelling of hay and the crisp morning air. Billy, the youngest, a gangly boy of 18 with more energy than sense, was telling a loud, convoluted story about a dream he'd had. "And I was trying to saddle this giant chicken," he was saying, gesturing wildly, "but my hands were made of bacon, and I kept getting tangled in." He broke off, grabbing a biscuit from the platter she'd just set down. In his enthusiastic clumsiness, he jostled her arm, the one with the bruise. Clara let out a small, involuntary cry of pain and flinched back so violently that the plate of eggs she was carrying slipped from her grasp. It shattered on the floor, a mess of yellow yolk and white shards. The room fell instantly silent. Every eye was on her. Billy's face fell, his expression one of pure mortification. "Oh, geez, Clara, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean. I'm just a clumsy oaf. It's all right," she stammered, dropping to her knees, fumbling to pick up the broken pieces of ceramic. Her cheeks were burning with shame. She felt like a fool, so easily startled, so obviously fragile. "Here, let me," Billy said, starting to kneel beside her. "Leave her be, Billy." The voice came from the doorway to the main room. It was Elias. He stood there, his towering frame filling the entrance, a mug of coffee in his hand. His face was grim, his eyes unreadable, but his voice was low and carried an unmistakable weight of command. The men all looked at him. Billy froze, halfway to the floor. Elias's gaze wasn't on the broken plate. It was on Clara's hunched form, and then it swept over the faces of his men. "We all have our ghosts," he said, the words dropping into the thick silence. "Let a person be." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The message was as clear as a brand on a calf. This woman, their quiet cook, was under his protection. Her past, her fears, her fragility. They were not to be a subject of sport or carelessness. They were to be respected. Jed, the old hand, was the first to react. He gave Billy a light cuff on the back of the head. "You heard the boss. Sit down and eat your bacon before it gets cold, you great galoot." He then looked at Clara, his expression holding a new, softer kind of respect. "Don't you worry about that plate, ma'am. We've broken plenty worse." The tension in the room broke. The men, following Jed's lead, turned back to their breakfast, their conversation resuming in more muted tones. Elias walked over to the stove, refilled his mug from the coffee pot, and then left the kitchen as quietly as he had entered. He never said a word directly to Clara, but his actions had spoken for him. He had seen her scars, and instead of casting her out, he had built a wall around her. Clara stayed on her knees for a moment longer, surrounded by the mess. But the shame was gone, replaced by a profound and bewildering sense of shock. He had defended her. He had stood up for her, not against a true threat, but against the casual thoughtlessness of the world, which could be just as cruel. Slowly, she began to pick up the pieces of the broken plate, her hands still shaking, but for an entirely different reason now. The incident with the broken plate marked a subtle but significant shift in the ranch's ecosystem. The wall Elias had built around Clara was respected by his men. They became more careful in their movements around her, their voices softer when they entered the kitchen. Billy, consumed with guilt, started doing little chores for her, chopping extra kindling for the stove or hauling buckets of water from the well without being asked. It was his clumsy, boyish way of apologizing, and Clara accepted it with a quiet nod that, to him, felt like total forgiveness. The invisible thread between Elias and Clara grew stronger, woven through with these new strands of shared knowledge and unspoken protection. He still didn't mention the marks. His silence on the subject was a gift, a space she could inhabit without having to explain or defend herself. In return, she began to let her guard down, just a fraction at a time. It started with her work. The kitchen became her undisputed kingdom, and she began to take small, creative risks. She found a patch of wild mint growing by the creek and made a refreshing tea. She discovered that the men, despite their rough exteriors, had a collective sweet tooth, and the nightly pies and cakes became more elaborate. Elias encouraged this burgeoning confidence in his own quiet way. On a trip to town, he returned not just with flour and salt, but with a small bag of precious cinnamon sticks and a tin of vanilla, items he'd seen her eyeing in Henderson's catalog. He left them on the kitchen table without a word. That night, the house was filled with the warm, sweet scent of a cinnamon apple pie, so delicious it rendered the men speechless. When Elias came into the kitchen later, the largest slice was waiting for him on a clean plate. Their silent language was becoming more articulate. One evening, he was hunched over his ledgers, the numbers swimming before his eyes. The cost of feed was up, and the price he'd gotten for his last small sale of yearlings was insultingly low. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Is something wrong, Mr. Thorne?" He looked up, startled. Clara stood in the doorway, a dish towel in her hands. She rarely spoke to him unless spoken to, and had never before initiated a conversation outside the kitchen. He was about to brush her off with a curt, ranch business, but something in her hesitant expression stopped him. She looked genuinely concerned. On an impulse, he gestured to the chair opposite him. "The numbers don't add up," he said, more to himself than to her. "They never do." She hesitated for a second, then glided into the room and sat on the very edge of the chair, as if ready to bolt at a moment's notice. "May I?" she asked, her gaze on the open ledger. Surprised, Elias pushed the book across the table. He watched as she leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her finger, slender and pale, traced a column of figures. She was silent for several long minutes, her lips moving slightly as she calculated. He had assumed she was uneducated, another poor, unfortunate soul with no prospects. He was beginning to realize how wrong he was. "Here," she said finally, pointing to a section. "The freight costs you were charged by the railway for the last shipment. They've calculated it by weight, but your contract with them specifies a flat rate per car for livestock feed. They've overcharged you by nearly $40. Elias stared at the page, then back at her. He'd spent an hour staring at that ledger and had missed it completely. $40 was a significant sum. It was the price of a good horse, or a month's wages for 2 men. And here, she continued, her initial hesitation gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. You're buying your salt lick in 50-pound blocks from Henderson. If you order it in bulk directly from the supplier in Kansas City, even with the shipping, you could save another 5 cents a pound. She went on, pointing out small discrepancies, suggesting efficiencies with a knowledge that was both broad and deep. Elias listened, stunned into silence. This timid, silent woman who flinched at loud noises had a mind as sharp as a finely honed blade. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. A shadow passed over her face. The light in her eyes dimmed. My father taught me," she said, her voice dropping back to a whisper. "He was a bookkeeper." She quickly stood up, her brief foray into the world outside the kitchen apparently over. "I'm sorry to have intruded. Good night, Mr. Thorne." She slipped away before he could say another word. He sat there for a long time, staring at the ledger, but he wasn't seeing the numbers anymore. He was seeing her, a bookkeeper's daughter, educated, intelligent. What series of terrible events had led a woman like her to be so desperate she would take a job as a cook on a remote ranch, carrying the marks of abuse on her body? The mystery of Clara May had just deepened, and his protective instinct was now mingled with a profound, burgeoning respect. He also discovered things about himself through her eyes. One rainy afternoon, when outdoor work was impossible, he was in the barn, rereading a worn copy of Moby Dick that had been his father's. He was so engrossed in the tale that he didn't hear her enter. She had come to gather eggs from the nesting boxes. He looked up to see her watching him, a look of pure surprise on her face. "You read?" she asked, the question soft. He felt a flush of something like embarrassment. His love of books was a private thing, a part of him that didn't fit the image of a rough, uneducated rancher. "My mother was a school teacher before she married," he explained gruffly. She believed a man who didn't read was no better than a man who couldn't. She simply nodded, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time he could recall. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows and revealing a glimpse of the woman she might have been, or could be. The moment was fleeting, but it lodged itself in his memory. They were two solitary people, slowly, cautiously, discovering the hidden chapters in each other's stories. This fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. The outside world, with its gossip and its cruelty, was never far away. The next supply run to town brought it crashing back. Elias had put it off as long as he could, but the pantry was getting low. As he tied his team to the hitching post outside Henderson's, he felt the familiar sense of being watched. The town felt different. The stares were no longer just curious. They were openly hostile. Inside the mercantile, Henderson was practically vibrating with self-important news. He leaned over the counter, his voice a low, conspiratorial hiss that carried through the entire store. "Thorne, you'd better be careful," he said, foregoing any pretense of a greeting. "Careful of what, Henderson?" Elias asked, his voice flat and cold. "That cook of yours. The one you're so protective of." Henderson's eyes glittered with malicious glee. "Heard some folks from up north been asking about a runaway. A young woman who fits her description. Stole from her benefactor, they say. A very important man. They're saying she's not right in the head. Prone to delusions." Elias felt a chill go down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was happening. The past she was running from was catching up. "Who's been asking?" he demanded. "Just people," Henderson said evasively, clearly enjoying his role as the purveyor of ominous news. "But the word is, her guardian is on his way to fetch her. A man of some standing. He's not going to be happy to find her shacked up on some remote ranch." The phrase, shacked up, was a deliberate insult, and it landed like a punch. Elias's hand clenched into a fist on the counter, making a stack of tin cans rattle. "She is not shacked up," he growled, his voice dangerously low. "She is an employee. and you would do well to remember that, Henderson. He gathered his supplies in a cold fury, paid his bill, and left the store without another word. But Henderson's words followed him, poisonous and persistent. Her guardian is on his way. The vague threat had become specific. A man was coming, the man who had likely put those marks on her arm. The thought of this man laying a hand on her again sent a wave of violent, possessive rage through Elias. She wasn't just an employee anymore. He knew that now. She was Clara, and the bar T was her sanctuary. His sanctuary, and he would be damned if he let anyone violate it. As he drove the wagon out of town, the weight of this new threat settled heavily upon him. The quiet life they had built felt like a house of cards, and the wind was starting to blow. He looked out at the vast, unforgiving landscape, and for the first time since he was a boy, Elias Thorne felt a prickle of fear. Not for himself, but for the quiet woman who put wildflowers on his windowsill and who had a mind as sharp as his own was stubborn. He was afraid of losing her. The ride back to the ranch was a torment. Every creak of the wagon wheels, every gust of wind, seemed to whisper Henderson's warning. Her guardian is on his way. The words were a brand on Elias's mind. He had brought Clara to the bar T to give her a job, a safe harbor. Now, it seemed he had only led her to a temporary hiding place, a pen where her hunter could more easily track her. The closer he got to the ranch, the heavier the dread in his stomach became. He thought of her quiet presence in his house, the scent of baking bread that now meant home to him, the fleeting, genuine smile he'd seen when she caught him reading. These were small, simple things, yet the thought of them being torn away left a gaping hole in his chest. He was a man accustomed to solitude, who had built his life around the principle of self-reliance. But her presence had, without his notice or permission, filled a void he hadn't even known was there. The idea of his house falling silent again, of the kitchen becoming just a functional room once more, was unbearable. For Clara, the ranch had become more than a sanctuary. It was a place of quiet healing. The constant, gnawing fear that had been her companion for years had begun to recede, replaced by the steady, predictable rhythms of ranch life. She had learned the names of Elias's horses. She knew that Jed liked his coffee black and strong, that Billy would eat anything sweet, and that Frank and Cole, the silent brothers, were devoted to her stew. She had even started taking short walks down by the creek in the late afternoons, daring to enjoy the beauty of the harsh landscape. She was beginning to trust the ground beneath her feet. Most of all, she was beginning to trust the towering, quiet man who was her employer. Elias Thorne was unlike any man she had ever known. He was powerful, yet he never used his power to intimidate her. He was observant, yet he never used his observations to judge her. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, marked, terrified, broken, and had responded not with disgust or anger, but with a quiet, unyielding protection. He had given her space, respect, and a silence that was more comforting than any words of reassurance could ever be. The thought of that being taken away, of being dragged back into the darkness she had fled, was a terror beyond imagining. The bar T was the first place she had ever felt safe. Losing it would be like dying a second time. The tension between them, born of this shared, unspoken dread, thickened in the following days. They circled each other, caught in a gravity of mutual concern. Elias found himself making excuses to be near the ranch house, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for a dust cloud that would signal an approaching rider. Clara grew quieter than ever, her work in the kitchen becoming a frantic, desperate ritual, as if by keeping her hands busy, she could keep her demons at bay. One afternoon, a powerful dust storm, a common peril of the plains, blew in from the north. The sky turned a sickly yellow-brown, and the wind howled like a banshee, whipping sand and grit against the house. All work stopped. The hands hunkered down in the bunkhouse, while Elias secured the barn. Clara, who had been caught outside bringing in laundry, had been forced to take shelter with him in the main house. The storm raged for a day and a night. The world outside was obliterated, reduced to a roaring, chaotic blur. Inside the small house, the silence was deafening. The wind rattled the windows and moaned in the chimney, a constant reminder of their isolation. They were trapped together in the dim, dusty light. For hours, they didn't speak. Elias sat by the fire, pretending to clean a rifle. Clara sat at the long table, mending one of his shirts, her stitches tiny and perfect. The close proximity was a physical pressure, forcing an intimacy they had both so carefully avoided. Finally, unable to bear the weight of the silence any longer, Elias spoke. "You're good with a needle," he said, his voice sounding rough in the quiet room. She looked up, startled. "My mother taught me. She said a woman should know how to make things whole again." There was a world of sadness in that simple statement. He nodded, looking into the fire. "My mother was a teacher," he found himself saying, repeating the confidence he'd shared in the barn. "She loved books more than anything. Except my father." A small, hesitant question came from her side of the room. What were they like? He was surprised by the question, and more surprised by his own desire to answer it. "My father was like this land, hard and unforgiving on the surface, but with a good heart if you knew where to look. My mother, she was the spring after a long winter. She brought the color back into his world." He fell silent, the memories both a comfort and an ache. "You miss them," she stated softly. It wasn't a question. Every day, he admitted, the words raw. It was a confession he had never made to another living soul. She was quiet for a long time. The wind howled, pressing in on them. "I don't remember my parents," she said, her voice a bare whisper. "I was in an orphanage. They said my father was a bookkeeper, but that's all I know. When I was 16, a man came. Mr. Blackwood. He told the matron he was a distant relative, my mother's cousin. He said he wanted to give me a home, a better life. He was respectable, wealthy, charming. The name hung in the air between them. Blackwood, the name of the monster." Elias's hands tightened on the rifle stock. He didn't look at her, knowing that if she saw the fury in his eyes, she would stop talking. He kept his gaze fixed on the fire, his body rigid, listening. "He was a benefactor to the town," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "He donated to the church, to the poor. Everyone thought he was a saint. But in his house, he was a different man. He believed in discipline. He said it was his duty to correct my flaws, to beat the sin out of me. The first time he used his cane, I thought I had done something terribly wrong. But then I realized it didn't matter what I did. He just enjoyed it." The story came out in broken pieces, a narrative of quiet horror, of years spent living in terror, of being a prisoner in a gilded cage. She told him how she managed his accounts, how she discovered he was cheating people, stealing from his own businesses, and how she had carefully, secretly siphoned off small amounts of money, her own stolen wages, until she had enough to run. "The last time," she whispered, her voice cracking, "he found out I had a little money saved. He called it theft. That's where the new mark came from. I knew I couldn't stay. I knew he would kill me, sooner or later. So I ran that night. I just ran." The storm outside seemed to pale in comparison to the one that had just been unleashed in the small, quiet room. Elias finally turned to look at her. Her face was pale, tears tracking silently through the fine layer of dust on her cheeks. But she wasn't looking at him with fear anymore. She was looking at him with the exhausted resignation of someone who had finally laid down their heaviest burden. He wanted to go to her, to offer some kind of comfort, but he was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the enormity of her suffering and the white-hot rage it ignited in him. Silas Blackwood. He had a name for his fury now. Before he could find the words to say, the sound of a horse neighing loudly from the barn cut through the howl of the wind. It was a sound of distress. Elias was on his feet in an instant. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me," he commanded, grabbing his heavy coat. He plunged out into the maelstrom, leaving Clara alone with the ghost she had just set free. The wind nearly tore the door from his hand. He fought his way toward the barn, leaning into the gale, grit stinging his face. The horse whinnied again, a sound of panic. As he wrestled the barn door open and slipped inside, he saw what was wrong. A section of the roof had been torn away by the wind, and rain and debris were pouring in on the terrified animals. He spent the next hour working in a controlled fury, moving the horses to the safer stalls, calming them with his voice and his steady hands. The physical labor was a release for the violent energy coursing through him. As he worked, another sound reached him, faint at first, then clearer. It was the frantic, desperate sound of a rider, pushing his horse to its limit, even in this weather. Through the swirling dust and rain, Elias saw a figure emerge, slumped over his horse's neck. It was Jed. He practically fell from his saddle as he reached the barn, his face grim and his clothes soaked. "Boss," he yelled over the wind. "I rode ahead of the storm. I was in town. I had to warn you." "Warn me of what?" Elias shouted back, grabbing the reins of Jed's exhausted horse. Jed staggered into the relative shelter of the barn, gasping for breath. "He's here, boss. The man. The one Henderson was talking about." Elias's blood ran cold. "Blackwood. That's him," Jed confirmed, his chest heaving. "Silas Blackwood. He rode in on the afternoon stage, just before the storm hit, dressed like a king. He's in the saloon right now, buying drinks for everyone, telling a sob story about his poor, simple-minded niece who wandered away from home. Says her name is Clara May. He's convinced half the town, including the sheriff, that he's her loving guardian, and he's come to take her home." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He wasn't on his way. He was here, now, in Prairie Ridge. The storm had trapped him in town, but it had also trapped him on the ranch. As soon as the wind died down, he would come. Jed grabbed Elias's arm, his expression urgent. "He's smooth, boss. Real smooth. He's got the law on his side. The sheriff is planning to ride out with him as soon as the storm breaks. To collect her." The timeline was no longer days or weeks. It was hours. The storm was their only shield, and it was already starting to abate. The wind, while still strong, had lost some of its terrifying force. Elias looked through the gap in the roof. The sky was still a turbulent gray, but the impenetrable wall of dust was thinning. They had a day, maybe less. He turned and strode back towards the house, his mind racing, every protective instinct, every ounce of his being, focused on a single purpose. He burst back into the kitchen, the wind and rain following him in. Clara was standing where he had left her, her face a mask of terror. She had heard Jed's arrival. She knew. "There's a man in town," Elias said, his voice grim and quiet, cutting through the sound of the dying storm. "His name is Silas Blackwood. He's asking for you." The name, spoken aloud by him, was the final blow. The fragile composure Clara had maintained shattered completely. A low, guttural sob escaped her lips, a sound of pure, animal despair. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, backing away from him as if he were the source of the threat. "No, no, no. He's told the sheriff you're his niece, that he's come to take you home," Elias continued, laying out the terrible facts, his voice devoid of emotion. He needed her to understand the reality of their situation. "I can't go back," she gasped, her eyes wild with panic. "I can't. I'll run. I'll run now, in the storm. He'll never find me." She looked desperately toward the door, ready to flee into the maelstrom, choosing the certainty of death on the prairie over the certainty of life with Blackwood. Elias moved faster than she could have imagined, crossing the room in 2 long strides and blocking her path. He didn't touch her, but his sheer presence was an immovable wall. "No," he said, his voice firm, absolute. "No more running." She stared up at him, her chest heaving with ragged breaths, her face a portrait of utter hopelessness. "But he has the law," she cried, her voice breaking. "He has papers. He'll say I'm his indentured ward. He'll show them the contract. They'll believe him. They always believe him. Let them," Elias said, his jaw set like granite. He had spent the last hour, the last weeks, circling this problem. He had seen the trap closing around them. And in the heart of the storm, both outside and in, he had found the only way out. It was a desperate, crazy, irrevocable move. It would change his life forever. But looking at her terrified face, he knew he would do it without a second's hesitation. He looked down at her, his expression softening for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something that was not pity, but a fierce, profound tenderness. "There's one way to make sure he can't touch you," he said, his voice low and intense. "One way to make sure his papers mean nothing. One way the law, even Sheriff Miller's law, will recognize you as belonging here. With me." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Clara stared at him, her tear-filled eyes wide with confusion, not yet daring to grasp his meaning. "He can't claim a man's wife," Elias stated simply. "We ride to town as soon as the storm breaks. We go to the preacher. We get married." The storm broke with the dawn. The wind died to a whisper, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily silent. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and sage. Elias had the horses hitched to the buckboard before the sun had fully crested the hills. He had explained the plan to Jed, whose only response was a slow nod and the grim statement, "It's a hell of a gamble, boss." Clara was pale and silent, moving as if in a trance. She had not argued or protested. The audacity of his plan seemed to have shocked her into a state of numb acquiescence. She had put on her best dress, a simple navy blue cotton that was mended at the cuff, and had pulled her hair back neatly. She looked not like a bride, but like a condemned prisoner walking to her own execution. As she came out of the house, Elias was waiting. He looked at her, taking in her frightened, resigned expression. For a moment, he faltered. He was forcing her into this, a desperate act to solve a desperate problem. It wasn't right. But then he thought of Blackwood, of the marks on her arm, and his resolve hardened like steel. This was not about rightness. It was about survival. He helped her onto the wagon seat, his hand briefly touching hers. Her skin was ice cold. He climbed up beside her and clicked the reins, the wagon lurching forward. The ride to town was a journey through a world of ghosts. They passed washed-out gullies and trees stripped of their leaves. The silence in the wagon was absolute, a vacuum filled with everything they couldn't say. As they approached Prairie Ridge, they could see that the town was already stirring. The arrival of Silas Blackwood had been the biggest news in months, and the impending confrontation was an event no one wanted to miss. People were gathered on porches, peering out of windows. As Elias drove the wagon down the main street, a hush fell. Every eye was on them. The towering, grim-faced rancher and his pale, silent cook. They were not heading toward the sheriff's office, as everyone expected. They drove right past it, and past the saloon where Blackwood was likely waiting. They stopped directly in front of the small, white-steepled church at the end of the street. Elias tethered the horses and then turned to help Clara down. He held her elbow, his grip firm and steady, a silent message of support. She stumbled slightly, her legs unsteady. Together, they walked up the short path to the preacher's house. Reverend Michaelis was a thin, nervous man with wispy gray hair. He answered the door with a Bible in his hand, his eyes wide with surprise. "Elias? What on earth?" "Reverend," Elias said, his voice calm and even. "Miss Clara May and I have come to be married." The Reverend's jaw dropped. He looked from Elias's implacable face to Clara's terrified one. "Married? But this is highly irregular. There are banns to be read, a waiting period." "We don't have time for that," Elias cut in, his voice polite but unyielding. "We need it done now. I have the license fee." He pressed a handful of coins into the preacher's numb hand. "It is a matter of great urgency." Reverend Michaelis was clearly flustered, torn between church protocol and the sheer force of Elias Thorne's will. He looked at Clara, his expression softening with concern. "My child, is this your wish?" Clara looked at the floor, then up at Elias. She saw the iron resolve in his eyes, the absolute certainty. He was her only hope, his crazy plan her only shield. She took a deep, shuddering breath and found a sliver of her own strength. "Yes, Reverend," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but clear. "It is." The ceremony was a stark, hurried affair in the preacher's dusty parlor. His wife, a stout, kind-faced woman, was called in to be the witness. She stood beside Clara, and at one point reached out and squeezed her cold hand. The Reverend read the words from the Book of Common Prayer, his voice trembling slightly. When he reached the part for the vows, Elias's voice was a low, steady rumble. I will. When it was Clara's turn, she hesitated for a heartbeat, her gaze darting to the window, as if she might still flee. Then she looked at Elias, at the man who had seen her scars and had not turned away, and whispered, I will. There was no ring. Elias had not thought of it. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, there was only a profound, echoing silence in the room. It was done. As they stepped out of the preacher's house and back into the harsh morning light, they saw that a crowd had gathered. And at the front of that crowd, standing beside a smug-looking Sheriff Miller, was a man Elias knew instantly must be Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was everything Clara had described. He was handsome in a severe, predatory way, dressed in an expensive black suit that was immaculate despite the storm. He had silvering hair at his temples and a smile that didn't reach his cold, dark eyes. He looked at Clara, and his smile widened, a look of triumphant possession. Ah, there you are, my dear, Blackwood said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He stepped forward, ignoring Elias completely. Sheriff, this is my poor, confused niece I was telling you about. Clara, this foolishness is over. You've caused enough trouble. Come along. He reached for her arm. Before his fingers could touch her, Elias moved. He didn't do it quickly or aggressively. He simply stepped between them, his body a solid wall of muscle and bone, blocking Blackwood's path. Clara instinctively shrank behind him, her hands gripping the back of his coat. Blackwood's smile faltered. He looked up at Elias, his eyes narrowing. Step aside, rancher. This is a family matter. She's not your niece, Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying across the silent street. And she's not going anywhere. Blackwood's facade of charm began to crack. A sneer twisted his lips. She is my indentured ward, and she absconded with my property. I have papers signed and sealed. She is bound to me. He turned to the sheriff. Sheriff Miller, I demand you enforce my legal claim. Sheriff Miller, a man who preferred to follow the path of least resistance and greatest influence, took a step forward. Thorne, the man has a legal document. You can't interfere. Elias didn't even look at the sheriff. His eyes were locked on Blackwood. He slowly, deliberately, reached in his coat pocket. For a heart-stopping moment, the crowd thought he was reaching for a gun. Blackwood took an involuntary step back. But Elias's hand emerged not with a pistol, but with a folded piece of paper. He held it up. She is my wife, Elias announced, his voice booming with an authority that dwarfed the sheriff's. He unfolded the paper. It was the marriage license, the ink still fresh, the Reverend's signature clear and bold. And in this territory, a man's wife is not another man's property. Not her body, not her labor. She is Mrs. Elias Thorne now, and she is home. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. Blackwood stared at the paper, his face a mask of disbelief, which quickly curdled into pure, incandescent rage. The smooth, respectable gentleman vanished, replaced by the monster Clara knew so well. You lie, he shrieked, his voice cracking. This is a trick, a sham. He lunged forward, his hands clawed, aiming for Clara. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply met Blackwood's charge with a single, powerful shove of his open palm against the man's chest. It was not a punch, but a contemptuous dismissal. Blackwood, for all his fine clothes, was no match for the raw strength of a man who spent his life wrestling with cattle on the land. He stumbled backward, tripped over his own feet, and went down hard in the muddy street, his fine black suit ruined. The town was utterly silent. The sight of the wealthy, influential Mr. Blackwood sprawling in the dirt like a common drunk was a shocking reversal of the established order. Elias stood over him, his shadow falling across the humiliated man. He finally turned his cold gaze to Sheriff Miller. You going to arrest a man for defending his wife, Sheriff? He asked, his voice laced with ice. Or are you going to ask Mr. Blackwood here to explain the marks on her arms? The ones that look like they were made by a walking cane? Because I'm sure my wife would be willing to show them to you. And to the circuit judge, when he comes through next month. He had laid the trap, and Blackwood had walked right into it. Elias had taken a private shame, and made it a public accusation. The murmuring in the crowd started, no longer whispers of gossip about Clara, but of suspicion about Blackwood. People who had been charmed by him now saw the ugly violence in his eyes. Sheriff Miller looked from the furious, mud-spattered Blackwood to the resolute, towering Elias, who now had not only moral authority on his side, but legal authority as well. The sheriff was no fool. He saw which way the wind was blowing. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his tone now official and cold, "I think your business in Prairie Ridge is concluded. The next stage leaves in an hour. I suggest you be on it." Blackwood stared up from the mud, his face a contortion of hate and defeat. He had been outmaneuvered, his power broken by a simple piece of paper and the quiet courage of two people who had nothing to lose. He scrambled to his feet, sputtered a curse, and stalked away toward the saloon, the eyes of the entire town following him, their judgment a palpable force. The threat was over. Neutralized. Elias turned to Clara. She was still standing behind him, her knuckles white where she gripped his coat. He gently took her hand. "It's over," he said softly. "Let's go home." The ride back to the bar T was as silent as the ride into town, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the heavy, anxious silence of dread, but the light, fragile silence of aftermath. The world seemed both strange and new, saturated with a clarity that follows a storm. They were husband and wife. The words were a bizarre and foreign concept, a legal fiction created out of desperation. Yet, as the wagon crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, the word home had never felt more real to either of them. Elias helped her down, his hand lingering at her waist for a moment longer than necessary. They walked into the house that was now legally, irrevocably theirs together. The kitchen, her domain, was the first place she went, as if seeking refuge in the familiar. He followed her in, feeling the same awkwardness he had on her first day, but was different now, charged with a new and terrifying intimacy. He had bound himself to this woman, to her past and her future. She turned from the stove to face him, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice quiet but steady. It was the first thing she had said to him since the ceremony. "I know," he replied simply. There was nothing else to say. He had made a choice. He would live with it. He would stand by it. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw no fear in her eyes. There was gratitude, yes, and a deep, soul-shaking exhaustion, but the hunted look was gone. In its place was a flicker of something new, a nascent strength he had only glimpsed before. "He won't be back," she said. It was not a question, but a declaration. She was not just a victim of her past anymore. She was a survivor of it. Her voice, though soft, held the finality of a closing door. "No," Elias agreed. "He won't." A comfortable quiet fell between them. She turned back to the stove and began to methodically build a fire, her movements no longer skittish or uncertain, but calm, measured, and purposeful. She was claiming her space, her life, her home. Elias watched her for a long moment, a strange feeling blooming in his chest, something warm and expansive. He had gone to town to protect his cook and had come back with a wife. The transaction felt both insane and perfectly, fundamentally right. He left her to her work, the familiar sounds of her moving about the kitchen a profound comfort. That evening, a new kind of normal settled over the ranch house. The men, who had heard the news from a jubilant Jed, were quiet and respectful, if a little awed. They addressed Clara as Mrs. Thorne, the title sounding strange and formal in the rustic kitchen. She accepted it with a shy dip of her head. Later, after the house had grown quiet, Elias sat in his usual chair by the fire, his book open on his lap, though he wasn't reading. He was listening to the soft sounds from the kitchen, the clink of a dish, the splash of water. When she finally emerged, she was carrying not a plate of food, but one of his work shirts. She had been mending a tear near the collar, her stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She walked over and placed the folded shirt on the small table beside his chair. Her task completed, she should have retreated back to her room, as was her habit. But she hesitated. Her hand, which had set the shirt down, lingered on the table, just inches from his own. The space between their hands was charged with unspoken emotion, with the weight of the day's events, with the terrifying, hopeful possibility of what lay ahead. He looked up from his book, his gaze meeting hers. In the warm, flickering firelight, he saw the deep, quiet strength in her, the resilience that had allowed her to survive the unthinkable. He saw not the timid cook he had hired, but the intelligent, courageous woman who had tallied his ledgers and faced down her monster. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and covered her hand with his. His hand was large, calloused, and rough from a lifetime of hard labor. Hers was small and delicate, but did not tremble or pull away. It simply rested there, accepting his touch. It was the first time they had touched with intention, not by accident or out of necessity. It was a simple, profound connection, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged between them in the crucible of fear and defiance. He looked at the woman the world had discarded and judged worthless, the woman he had married to save her. And in that quiet moment, with his hand covering hers, he knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that he had done more than save her. He had saved himself from a life of hollow solitude. The towering rancher looked at his wife, and for the first time, he truly saw his heart. The small, warm light of their cabin was a defiant star against the vast, dark canvas of the prairie, a sanctuary built not of wood and sod, but of a shocking act of compassion and the enduring promise of shared dawn. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.